They told him the eviction notice had been taped to the door for 3 days before he noticed it. That was the part that stayed with him. Not the notice itself, but the 3 days. 3 days he'd walked past that door, come home to that door, sat on the other side of that door, eating canned soup and watching the evening news, and never once saw the yellow paper curling at the corner, flapping every time the wind came down the hallway of that apartment building in Billings. 3 days. His name was Edmund. Edmund Ray Kowalski, 64 years old, 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 marriage that had lasted 22 years before it quietly gave out the way old engines do, not with a bang, just a long, gradual silence where the turning used to be. His son Patrick lived in Denver and called on holidays. His daughter, Suzanne, was somewhere outside of Boise with her husband, and 2 kids Edmund had met exactly 4 times. He kept their school photos in a kitchen drawer because he didn't own any frames. The apartment in Billings had been his for 11 years. It wasn't much. A second-floor unit above a dry cleaning shop that smelled like solvent in the summers and steam in the winters. The carpet was the color of old mustard. The radiator knocked every night at 2 in the morning like something was trying to get out. Edmund had long since stopped hearing it. What he heard on the morning he finally read the notice was the sound of his own breathing. Slow, then faster. The landlord had given him 60 days. Edmund had used 58 of them arguing with the VA about a reimbursement claim, fixing the transmission on his truck, and trying not to think about the fact that everything he'd saved over the last decade had gone into his wife's medical bills, then his own. Then the gap between what Social Security paid and what living in Billings actually cost. The math had stopped working about 2 years ago. He'd been ignoring the math. On day 59, he loaded what fit into the back of his truck: a sleeping bag, a cast iron skillet, his father's tackle box, a plastic crate of clothes, the dog kennel, and inside it, a 6-year-old Labrador mix named Cooper who watched the whole process with the kind of patient attention that dogs bring to things they don't understand but know are serious. Edmund had found Cooper at the county shelter 3 years prior on a Tuesday afternoon, when he'd only gone in to drop off some old towels they were requesting as donations. Cooper had been in a run near the back, not barking, not pacing, just sitting there with his big tan head resting on his front paws, watching Edmund with eyes the color of dark honey. Edmund had stood in front of that kennel for a long time. Then he'd filled out the paperwork. That was the best decision he'd made in years, and he knew it. He didn't know, on that cold October morning when he backed the truck out of the lot for the last time, that the next best decision was still 4 hours north of him, down a dirt road that didn't have a name on any map he owned. He'd heard about the property from a man named Walt Sutter at the American Legion Hall in Roundup, where Edmund sometimes drove on Thursday evenings because the coffee was free. And there were people there who didn't need much explaining. Walt had the kind of weathered face that looks carved rather than aged, and he'd mentioned, not to Edmund specifically, just to the table, that there was an old homestead up in the foothills past Lavina that the county had been trying to unload for years. Back taxes. Nobody wanted it. How much? Edmund had asked. Walt shrugged. Last I heard, they'd take $10 just to clear it off the books. Edmund had written the address on a napkin and put it in his shirt pocket. That was 3 weeks before the eviction notice. He'd told himself it was just something to know. Just information. Now the napkin was on the dashboard, and he was driving north with Cooper's nose pressed against the cracked-open rear window, and the sky ahead was the flat gray of a sky that hasn't decided yet whether to snow. The dirt road Walt had described turned off the county highway, about 8 miles past Lavina, marked only by a rusted mailbox with no name on it, and a strand of barbed wire fence that sagged between 2 posts like it had given up. Edmund almost missed it. He pulled over, looked at the napkin, looked at the mailbox, and turned. The road went up into pine and scrub for about a mile. Edmund's truck groaned on the ruts. Cooper shifted in the back, repositioning himself, then settled again. What Edmund found at the end of the road was not what he'd hoped for, and was not entirely what he'd feared. It was a homestead cabin, maybe 400 square feet, built from logs that had gone dark with age. The roof had a sag in the middle like a tired back. One of the front windows was gone entirely, replaced by a sheet of plywood that had warped over however many winters it had sat there. The porch steps were rotten on one side, the other side missing altogether. A lean-to shed to the left had partially collapsed, its far wall folded inward under the weight of old pine needles and time. But the walls were standing, all 4 of them. And the chimney, a fieldstone chimney that ran up the right side of the cabin, stood perfectly straight, as though it had been paying attention all those years when everything else was letting go. Edmund sat in the truck for a while with the engine running. Cooper made a low sound, not quite a whine. "I know," Edmund said. He got out. The cold hit him across the face. That particular Montana cold that doesn't come at you from any direction, just surrounds you. He walked up to the cabin slowly, tested the porch boards with one boot before committing his weight. The boards held except where they didn't, and where they didn't, he stepped around. The front door was unlocked. It wasn't even latched. It just stood slightly open, as if someone had left in a hurry 50 years ago and meant to come back. Inside smelled like mice and dust, and something older, the dry, mineral smell of a place that has been sealed from the weather long enough to develop its own air. There was a rusted wood stove against the back wall, not the fireplace he'd expected, which was better because wood stoves were workable. There was a wooden table with 3 legs and the 4th resting on a flattened tin can. There was a built-in bunk along one wall, the lower mattress long since dissolved into a dark stain, the upper one missing entirely. Edmund stood in the middle of the single room and turned slowly. The light came through the plywood window in thin lines, yellow and cold. Dust moved in it. Cooper sat in the doorway behind him, watching. "Well," Edmund said to no one. "All right." He drove back down to Lavina that afternoon, found the county assessor's office 40 minutes away in Roundup, and sat across a desk from a woman named Darlene who looked like she'd heard every variety of human story and retained a measured skepticism about all of them. Edmund explained what he wanted. Darlene typed something. She looked at her screen for a long time. "That property's been sitting since 1987, she said. "Last owner died intestate. County's been carrying it. Walt Sutter said you'd take $10. Darlene's expression changed in a way that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "Walt Sutter's been saying that about a lot of things for 20 years. She looked at her screen again. "Back taxes and processing fees bring it to $412. We can set up a payment plan." Edmund put $412 in cash on the desk, money he'd been carrying in an envelope in the glove compartment for 2 weeks, money he'd told himself was for emergencies. He supposed this qualified. Darlene counted it without commenting, wrote him a receipt, and told him the deed would come in the mail within 6 to 8 weeks. Edmund drove back up the dirt road as the sun was getting low. He unloaded his sleeping bag, and the cast-iron skillet and the crate of clothes. He let Cooper out of the kennel and watched him move through the tall yellow grass around the cabin perimeter, nose working, tail carrying its slow flag of curiosity. He got a fire going in the wood stove, with pine branches broken from a dead fall he'd found near the shed. The smoke backed up at first. The flue was clogged with nesting material, and he spent an hour on the roof in the near dark with a stick, clearing it, coming down with soot on his hands and a strange specific satisfaction that he hadn't felt in a long time. The fire caught properly around 9 o'clock. The cabin was still cold, except in a 4-foot radius around the stove. But it was a different kind of cold than outside. It was contained. Cooper curled up with his back against the warm side of the stove and sighed in that deep, full-body way that dogs do when they've decided a place is acceptable. Edmund ate crackers and peanut butter and listened to the wind move through the pines. It sounded like water, distant and constant. He didn't sleep much that first night, but before he did, he lay in the sleeping bag on the floor, with his head on a folded jacket, looking up at the ceiling. Someone long ago had nailed a single piece of tin over a hole, and he thought, I have been in worse places than this and come home. And then, because that thought surprised him slightly, he thought it again. The county road department had a surplus auction every November, and that's where Edmund found a second-hand generator for $80, a stack of used lumber for $60, and a sheet of corrugated metal roofing that the man selling it let go for $20 because it was bent at one end and he didn't want to haul it back. Edmund took it anyway. A bent piece of roofing was still roofing. He started with the roof because the roof was the argument the cabin was losing. If the center kept sagging, nothing else he fixed would matter. He spent the first 3 weeks pulling off the worst of the old cedar shingles, replacing 2 rafters that had split through, and laying the corrugated metal over the section above the stove, where the rot was deepest. He had no one to help him hold the long pieces, so he used ropes looped over the ridge beam, pulling one end up while wedging the other with a block of wood, working slowly, twice dropping a panel and having to start over. Cooper supervised, that was the word for it. He positioned himself at various points around the cabin and watched Edmund work with his head tilted at an angle that suggested either concern or professional interest. When Edmund came down from the roof at the end of a day, with his hands cracked and his back complaining, Cooper would push his head against Edmund's leg and stand there until Edmund scratched his ears. I know, Edmund would say. It was becoming their language. The window came next. Edmund found glass at a salvage yard in Billings. A trip he made once a week to pick up materials and use the phone in the parking lot of the library to deal with the VA, which was processing his disability claim with the urgency of a geologic event. He'd been fighting for the claim for 2 years. A buddy from the Legion had connected him with a VSO in Billings named Randolph, who was known for not giving up, and Randolph was now on the case with a particular tenacity that Edmund found both reassuring and exhausting to be around. He framed the window himself. His hands remembered carpentry, the way they remembered other things from before. Not consciously, but in the muscle, in the angle of the wrist, the pressure of the grip. His father had built things. Edmund had helped as a boy, holding boards, passing nails, being told to pay attention when he'd rather be somewhere else. He'd paid attention anyway. He was grateful now for a version of himself that had listened even when listening felt like an imposition. By December, the cabin had a new window, a functioning roof, and a door that actually latched. The porch steps he rebuilt from the lumber surplus, cutting each board to length in the cold with a handsaw, because his power saw had stopped working, and he couldn't afford to replace it yet. It took 3 days longer than it should have. He didn't mind. He'd stopped minding the extra time it took to do things without help. He got water from a creek about a quarter-mile east, carrying it in a pair of 5-gallon jugs he'd found in the shed, rinsed, then boiled. The outhouse behind the cabin needed a new door and a new roof, both of which he provided by Thanksgiving, working by headlamp when the daylight ran out early, which it did constantly in November in Montana. His daughter called the 3rd week of December. She'd gotten his new number. He'd bought a prepaid phone in Billings from Patrick, who'd gotten it from Edmund himself in a conversation Edmund only half remembered making. "Dad," Suzanne said, "Patrick says you're living in he said a shack. "A cabin," Edmund said. He was standing outside because the reception inside was bad. In the middle of nowhere, in the foothills, past Lavina. There was a silence on her end that had its own temperature. "Are you okay? I'm building something," Edmund said. Another silence. Then, "What does that mean?" He looked out at the property, the shed he was going to fix next, the line of pines that broke the wind from the north, the smoke rising straight from the chimney in the still air. Cooper was in the grass near the tree line, following some scent trail with the focused intensity of someone reading an important document. "It means I'm okay," Edmund said. She called again at Christmas. They talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than they'd talked in a year. Suzanne told him about her kids, her job teaching 4th grade, a trip they were planning to Yellowstone in the summer. Edmund told her about the roof and the window, and how Cooper had started barking at the creek in the mornings, which he suspected was about otters. "You sound different," she said before she hung up. Edmund thought about that for a while after the call ended. He wasn't sure different was the right word. He thought maybe it was more like less covered over. January was the hardest month. The cold came down from Canada like it meant to stay. And for 3 weeks the temperature didn't get above 12 degrees in the day, and dropped to -20 at night. Edmund kept the wood stove running around the clock, waking every 2 hours to feed it, sleeping in his coat and 2 pairs of socks, pulling Cooper close on the sleeping bag because the dog's warmth was a practical matter, not a sentimental one, though it was both. He ran out of propane for the camp stove he cooked on, and spent a week eating things that didn't need heat. Crackers, jerky, peanut butter, canned beans eaten cold directly from the can. The generator died in the 2nd week of January, a fuel line issue that turned out to be simple once he found a video about it at the library. But getting to the library and back in those temperatures on roads that hadn't been fully plowed was its own project. He didn't complain about any of this to anyone, which was partly his nature, and partly because there was no one nearby to complain to. The nearest occupied property was a cattle operation 3 miles down the county road. Edmund had met the owner, a quiet man named Jasper, in November. They'd waved from their respective trucks at the turnoff, but hadn't spoken to him since. There were nights in January when he lay in the cold with Cooper pressed against him and let himself think clearly about whether this had been a mistake. He didn't avoid the question the way he'd avoided other things. He turned it over. He looked at the 4 walls he'd worked on, the chimney drawing cleanly now, the window he'd set himself. He thought about the alternative, which was a shelter somewhere, or a couch in Patrick's apartment in Denver, and the version of himself that would be produced by that situation. The cabin felt like his, even in January, even with cold coming through the floor. Because he hadn't yet figured out the insulation underneath, it felt like a thing he had a claim on, not just legally. Something else. He thought about what his CO had said to him once in 1969, outside a village in Quang Ngai province, when Edmund was 23 and had just done something difficult that he wasn't sure he was going to be able to do again. The CO had looked at him for a long time and then said, "The fact that you're not sure is what makes you someone I'd want with me." Edmund had carried that for 40 years without entirely knowing why. He understood it a little better now. He got through January. February arrived and the cold broke its own back slowly, the way it does in Montana, grudgingly, a few degrees at a time. Then all at once a week in the middle of the month where it felt like the land was exhaling. He insulated the floor in February. He found a source of recycled bat insulation through Randolph at the VSO, who had a brother-in-law with a construction business, and got 300 square feet for the cost of the gas to go pick it up. He pulled up the plank floor. The planks were in better shape than he'd expected. Yellow pine, old growth, probably original to the cabin, and laid insulation in the joist-and-soist bays and put the planks back down. The difference was immediate. By evening, the wood stove was heating the whole cabin to 65 degrees, instead of struggling to hold 50 in the corners. He stood in the middle of the room and felt 65 degrees, like something given back to him. Spring came the way it comes in Montana hill country. Not gradually but in episodes, warm days interrupting cold ones, mud alternating with late snow, the creek running faster and louder until one morning in April, Edmund walked down to fill the jugs and found it running 3 times wider than before, brown with snowmelt, and had to pick a new crossing point, upstream where a fallen log offered a bridge. Cooper loved the creek in spring. He'd wade in up to his chest and stand there with his mouth open and his eyes half closed, looking ridiculous and content. Edmund started bringing a camp chair down in the afternoons, sitting with a cup of coffee while Cooper waded, and those were some of the better hours of his day. The light on the water, the sound of it, the dog in the middle of it, looking like he'd solved a problem. Everyone else had been too complicated to work out. The disability claim came through in March. $1,500 a month, retroactive to the date of first filing, which meant a lump sum that Edmund stared at on the VSO office computer screen for a long time before the number became real. Randolph shook his hand with both hands and said something Edmund didn't entirely hear because he was busy doing math for the first time in 2 years. And, finding that it worked, he bought a proper bed, a real mattress, a frame, delivered by a hardware store in Roundup, whose owner arranged to have his nephew drive it up the dirt road on a flatbed. Edmund paid him extra, and they shook hands, and the nephew helped carry the frame inside without being asked, which Edmund received as a kind of grace. He bought lumber for the shed rebuild. He bought a new power saw. He bought a water filtration system that meant he no longer needed to boil every gallon. He bought seeds, tomatoes, beans, squash, a late-season radish, and started them in tin cans on the windowsill in April, tending them with a care that surprised him slightly. The way a thing you didn't know you needed surprises you once you have it. Jasper from the cattle operation came by one morning in May, driving down the dirt road in a truck that was older than Edmund's truck and in better shape. He brought a dozen eggs and a mason jar of his wife's strawberry preserves and stood on the rebuilt porch with his hat in his hands and said he'd noticed the improvements and wanted to say they were good work. Edmund thanked him. They stood for a while in the easy silence of two men who didn't feel the need to fill air with words. Then Jasper said there was a thing happening at the county fairgrounds in Lavina at the end of June, a barbecue and fundraiser for the local volunteer fire department, and Edmund might consider coming. I might, Edmund said. He went. He sat at a long table under a tent with Jasper and Jasper's wife, a small, energetic woman named Carolyn, who had opinions about everything and stated them cheerfully, as if opinions were gifts she was offering. He ate pulled pork and potato salad, and a slice of pie that tasted like his mother's kitchen, and was made by someone named Hattie Gruber, who was 91 years old, and still entered the county fair baking competition every August, which she had won 14 consecutive times. He met people. Not many, and not all at once, but enough. A mechanic named Dale from Roundup, who'd done 2 years in the army, and thought Vietnam was different from what he knew, but looked at Edmund the way you look at someone who carries a weight you recognize the shape of. A retired schoolteacher named June, not the one from any list, but a woman in her 70s with silver hair and a precise way of speaking who asked Edmund what he was building and listened to his answer without filling in the gaps the way people sometimes do. That sounds like real work, June said. It is, Edmund said. Good, she said, and meant it, and he knew she meant it. He'd told Randolph in passing about the cabin. Not the full story, just the outline. And Randolph, who seemed to know everyone in a 4-county radius, and was constitutionally incapable of leaving a useful connection unshared, mentioned it to a man at the VA in Billings named Tom Weller, who ran a small program connecting veterans in crisis with transitional housing options. Tom Weller called Edmund in June. I'm not a housing provider, Edmund said. I live there. I know, Tom said. But I've got veterans who need something like what you had, a place to land that isn't a shelter, something real, somewhere a person can work toward something. He paused. I'm not asking you to take anyone in. I'm asking if you'd be willing to talk to a couple guys. Let them come see what you built. Edmund thought about this for a long time. Then he said yes. The first man who came was named Bernard, not from any name he'd encountered before. A 48-year-old Marine from Butte who'd done 2 tours in Iraq and come back to a job that was gone and a relationship that followed the job. Bernard drove up the dirt road on a Saturday morning in July, got out of his car, and stood looking at the cabin and the property around it with an expression Edmund recognized the way you recognize weather. Not the specific weather, but the type of it. You did all this yourself, Bernard said. Most of it. Bernard walked around the property slowly, the way Edmund had walked around it that first day. He looked at the shed that was upright again, the vegetable garden that was producing, the line of firewood along the south wall of the cabin. He came back to where Edmund was standing by the porch. "How'd you start?" Bernard said. Edmund thought about the eviction notice he'd walked past for 3 days. The $412 on Darlene's desk. The first night on the floor with the sleeping bag and the crackers and Cooper pressed against his side. "I started with the roof," he said, "because if you don't fix the roof first, nothing else holds." Bernard nodded slowly. He understood that this was not only about roofs. They sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked for 3 hours. Bernard came back 2 more times that summer, and the second time he brought tools, and he and Edmund rebuilt the back wall of the shed together, working mostly in silence with the radio on low. And it was the kind of silence that has content to it, that carries something, instead of just marking the absence of noise. The second man Tom sent was named Garrett, but not any Garrett from the list of names Edmund carried in his head from previous encounters. This was a different person entirely. 26 years old, Army, 1 tour in Afghanistan, just out and not sure what the other side of the door looked like. He sat on the porch with his hands around a coffee mug and didn't say much, mostly looked. Cooper lay at his feet without being invited, which was something Cooper did with certain people and not others. And Edmund had come to trust Cooper's red that fall, with help from Tom Weller's office and a small grant from a veterans organization in Billings that Randolph had identified and applied for. On Edmund's behalf, he converted the shed, fully rebuilt now, properly roofed, properly floored, into a single-room bunkhouse. A cot, a wood stove of its own, a hook for a coat and a window that faced east. It wasn't much. It was exactly enough. Suzanne came in September with her husband, a quiet man named Brian who shook Edmund's hand firmly and then mostly listened, and their 2 kids, Lily and Owen, who ran circuits around the property for most of the first afternoon, while Cooper tried to keep track of them with visible effort and increasing bewilderment. Suzanne stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked around at what her father had made of it. The clean floor, the shelves he'd built along one wall, the curtains in the window that came from a thrift store in Roundup, the stack of library books on the table beside a mug and a paperback, and a photograph of a young Edmund in uniform that he'd found in his father's things and finally gotten framed. She didn't say anything for a moment. "You built all this," she finally said. It wasn't quite a question. "I had help," Edmund said. Toward the end, she turned to look at him and her expression was something he hadn't seen from her in a long time, something that reminded him of when she was very small and used to watch him do things with her whole face open to the information. "You look like yourself," she said. He didn't know exactly what that meant, which was probably what made it true. There's a moment. Edmund couldn't have told you the exact date, because it wasn't that kind of moment when a place stops being a project and becomes a home. It happens somewhere between the last repair you make because you have to, and the first one you make because you want to. Between surviving a winter and planting for the next one. Between eating alone by a stove, because there's no alternative, and choosing to eat outside in the October light, because the light is too good not to sit in. Cooper was there for all of it. That needed to be said. He was there on the floor the first night, there on the roof the day Edmund nearly slipped on the corrugated metal, and caught himself on the ridge beam with his heart going fast, and Cooper watching from below, with his head up and his whole attention given over entirely to one single thing. Cooper was there the day the disability check cleared, there when Bernard came, there when Suzanne's kids ran screaming circles in the grass, there when the first veteran, a quiet man, whose name Edmund kept private out of a respect he didn't need to explain, slept in the bunkhouse and came out in the morning and looked at the mountains in the early light and said, very quietly, "This is good. A dog doesn't fix what's broken in a person." Edmund knew that. Cooper hadn't fixed anything. What he'd done was something more precise. He'd kept the accounting honest. In the long nights of January, when the cold came through the floor and the math of Edmund's situation could tip either direction, Cooper's presence had been a kind of evidence. Evidence that something needed him. That need, simple, uncomplicated, non-negotiable, had been enough to get through a great many mornings that didn't announce themselves as survivable until you were already through them. Edmund understood now that this was not a small thing. In fact, he was fairly certain it was one of the largest things. By the second autumn, the property had a name, which Edmund hadn't planned but which arrived the way things arrive when you stop trying to make them. Someone in Tom Weller's office had begun referring to it as Kowalski's place in their paperwork, which then became the Kowalski property, which Carolyn from the cattle operation one day shortened to just the Kowalski. Said the way you'd say the name of somewhere with a reason to exist. Edmund thought that was fine. He thought that was more than fine. He was sitting on the porch the evening of the day he thought this, coffee in hand, looking out at the property in the last light, the shed that was a bunkhouse now, the garden coming down for winter, the line of firewood that was higher than last year because he'd had help cutting it, the mountains north of him that had no opinion about any of this, and were therefore restful to look at. And Cooper was beside him, chin on the porch rail, watching the tree line with the specific alertness of a dog who has heard something you haven't yet. The wind came through the pines. It sounded like water, like always. Edmund put his hand on Cooper's back, felt the warmth there, the breathing. He wasn't waiting for anything. That was the part that had changed.